Hey, good morning, everyone. Good morning. So good to see you here. I'm Lee Pelton. I'm president and CEO of the Boston Foundation, and it's my honor to welcome you, those of you here in person with us, and then we also have some folks joining online. Of course, this is our launch event for our 2024 Housing Report Card, which has become uh, something that people wait for every year, it seems. And Luke, I heard you on the radio this morning. You were terrific, so thank you. It feels especially good to be in your company this morning and to share space with others who show up for our community each and every day, no matter the challenges, to help make Greater Boston a place where everyone can thrive and call home. The results of the presidential election have left many of us wondering what we will face in January when the Trump administration is back in office. And regardless of how you or we feel about the election, it bore further testament to the deep discontent in our country and even here in the Commonwealth. You know, at the Boston Foundation, we are using this moment to share time together, to be human together, and to work together to affirm the ambition which sits at the heart of our work, that sits at the heart of your work. And that ambition, of course, is to achieve equity by repairing harms and building and sustaining a vital, prosperous city in a region where opportunity and equity and justice is extended and available to each and every one of us. TBF's mission is to improve lives and strengthen communities, and we do that, of course, and we can only do that when we're in deep relationship with all of you. I want to take this moment to thank you for the work that you do, work that matters, and work that makes a difference. And as I thought about what to say to you this morning, I was inspired by the latest Boston Indicators Upzone report, which is authored by the incredible Amy Dane. Are you here, Amy? No, she's not here, is she? So she's online. Hi, see you. She wrote beautifully about the quality of leadership she has seen across our communities. She said, in communities across Massachusetts, representatives of the select boards, finance committees, school committees, and planning boards have shown deep understanding of the complex issues involved in the MBTA community's zoning. They respectfully articulate their groups of majority and minority positions, informing hundreds of their gathered neighbors and the decision makers. And while this year's housing report is certainly sobering, it offers further evidence of the challenges that we continue to face. And yet we live in a state which has always sought to seek solutions to some of our most pressing problems. So let us be proud that Massachusetts is one of 4 states in the Union with a rental voucher program. And on August 6th of this year, just a couple of months ago, Governor Healy signed into law the Affordable Homes Act into law, as you all know, authorizing over $5 billion in spending over the next 5 years, along with nearly 50 policy initiatives to counter rising house costs, modernize our public housing system, unlocking housing production in the state, and boost programs that support first-time home buyers and home ownerships for low to moderate income folks. In addition to the passing of the NBTA Communities Law was an important step towards changing archaic zoning laws to help us build more multifamily housing near transit lines. And this year's report also dives into another potential solution to our housing supply shortage and discusses the opportunities and pros and cons of using public land as sites for new affordable housing units. Mayor Wu's administration has already identified almost 10 million square feet of potentially underutilized land that could be used for affordable and transitional housing, and is actively attempting to repurpose several properties in this particular way. Change is possible when we learn together and partner together towards solutions. And living in the shadows of last Tuesday's election, let us, as best we can, seek to celebrate and be buoyed by optimism and by hope. For Psalms exhorts us that weeping may endure for a night, but joy cometh in the morning. Our work is ever so more important, and never more so than it is today. And so I am, again, very grateful to each of you for all that you do to support the people and the families who live and work and study in our Commonwealth. And I hope that you will find this report and today's conversation to be especially meaningful and responsive to many of the housing needs that we have discussed for many, many years. So now it's my pleasure, Luke, to turn it over to Luke Schuster, if you don't know him, who's the Executive Director of the Boston Indicators, to present the core metrics section of this year's report. Luke.
Thanks, Lee. Appreciate that opening. Morning, everybody. So for the last several years, the way we've structured the report card is to have the core metrics section, which has been produced by the Boston Indicators team, and then a special topic analysis this year done by Professor Katie Einstein, Max Palmer, and Danielle Mulligan at BU. So we got a lot to get through presenting both sections of the report and then getting into a rich panel discussion. So I'm going to try and do this relatively quickly. Here are the 6 subsections that make up core metrics this year. I'm going to present the first 3, then pass it to my colleague Aja Kennedy to do the second 3. Also want to give a really quick shout out to our colleagues Peter Cherchak and Lucas Munson, who did a ton of the work on the report card this year. So I think that's it. Let's get right into it. This graph is a graph of the total population of Greater Boston back to 2010. Don't sweat too much the sort of year-over-year changes. I think the key thing is the broad trend here, where we're a region that was growing pretty steadily throughout the 2010s, and that's basically entirely halted for the last 4 years. Over the last several years, we've actually seen increased domestic outmigration to other parts of the country, driven in large part by young families. And fortunately, that's just been offset by international immigration in those recent years. And that's one of the real threats we face moving forward. Can we continue to rely on international immigration to sort of save our butts in terms of leveling out our regional population? Because again, we've been losing population to other parts of the country for several years now. Just really quickly going to flash a couple of other socioeconomic measures. In this case, I'm going to highlight 2 dimensions of inequality. Obviously, many folks in the region are doing quite well, but we're a region plagued with persistent levels of income inequality. This is just one way to look at it. It's the ratio of top incomes to bottom, comparing across major metro areas in the country, and we have the 3rd highest level of income inequality on this measure. Another measure of inequality we rarely look at, I think probably because it feels so obvious, but we thought it'd be interesting to show this year, is just the difference between incomes earned by homeowners and renters. And so here we do that and also break out by race. And I'll highlight 2 findings. One is just all homeowner groups, regardless of race, earn significantly more than all renter groups. And there's also just a really huge gap between the top homeowner groups, Asian and white households, compared to Latino and Black renter households who earn roughly a quarter of what white and Asian homeowners earn in Greater Boston. All right, so let's get into some of the core housing data, starting with supply. Lee already mentioned a bunch of the recent initiatives at the state and local level in Massachusetts to try and ramp up home building. Unfortunately, it just takes a long time to permit and then build all the housing that we need to kind of dig ourselves out of the hole we've found ourselves in. So we wouldn't expect the data I'm about to present to actually show that yet, but these are the kind of measures we're going to need to keep tracking in coming years to see if the policy efforts we've adopted are at the scale we need to build the tens, probably hundreds of thousands of new units that we need. So let me start by looking at new housing permits statewide in this case over a very long time frame back to 1960. And I'll highlight a few things moving roughly left to right on the graph. So first, we were just permitting many more houses statewide in the 70s and 80s than we are today. And frankly, that was at a time when there was less demand to live in Massachusetts. Shifting to the right a little bit, you can see there was an uptick in housing production in the 2010s, still far lower than that earlier period, but I think that was a reflection of a recognition we need to build more housing, and we were doing a bit of that. But then, unfortunately, the very last year, 2023, we see a real decline. And that's probably mostly driven by broader market forces, construction costs remaining really high post-pandemic, and interest rates spiking significantly in 2023 and continuing to today. And those high interest rates don't just affect the ability of individual families to afford a mortgage, but also larger institutional investors who need financing to build larger multifamily projects. And a big part of that drop in 2023, and it seems through 2024, is a drop in multifamily housing construction in particular. The data we're using here from the Census Building Permit Survey is flawed for a bunch of reasons, but it's the best we've got for long-term trends across the whole state. Colleagues at MAPC helped share with us far better administrative data for the 15 communities that make up the Metro Mayors Coalition and the inner core. And so we've got a nice walkthrough of that in the report. I'm just going to tease some of the data here. Don't expect you to be able to digest all this on this slide, but this has new building permits back to 2015 for those 15 communities. And I'll highlight here, it's really just a subset of 5 or 6 of these communities that have done most of the heavy lifting in terms of new home building since 2015. What this has added up to region-wide is this Metro Mayors Coalition lagging behind its ambitious target of building 185,000 new units by 2030. We've updated this graph every year in the report card for several years now, and you can see the purple bar growing, which is good, but a gap growing further each year because we're lagging behind that pace of the target that was set. What does this mean in terms of the experience of actual households looking for housing at any moment in time? Rental vacancy rates remain extremely low, and a very similar picture on homeownership vacancy rates in Greater Boston. Okay, so what's all this translating into in terms of prices, rents, and affordability? This is a sort of top-line comparison of the trend in home prices in purple with rents in yellow back to 2015. And you can see both up very significantly over these 9 or 10 years. Prices outpacing rents, though. And there's a little good news here on rents. If you look on the right-hand side, rents have actually really leveled off in 2024. So they've leveled off at a historically high level, but that's better than continued increases at the very least. We've got a lot more in the report on rents. I'm going to show a few more graphs and then pass it to Aja that just focus on the home ownership picture. One data point on rents, more than half of all renter households now spend more than 30% of their income on rent, and that goes up to 56 and 60% respectively for Black and Latino households in Greater Boston. So on the for sale market, this is a map of median single-family sale prices for the first half of 2024 across the region, and we've got 35 municipalities with median sale prices above $1 million now, and actually in 4 places, Brookline, Cambridge, Wellesley, and Weston, median sale prices above $2 million as of June 2024. Now, if you'll remember, a year ago, really year and a half ago, as mortgage interest rates were spiking, there was a sense that maybe this would actually put some downward pressure on prices and provide some relief to potential home buyers. What happened instead was this phenomenon of mortgage rate lock, which has been out there in the discussion recently. For existing homeowners who locked in a much lower mortgage interest rate several years prior, the gap between that and the new mortgage they would take out if they were going to sell their home and buy a new one grew significantly. And so that's really frozen the market, and far less supply has gone on the market at any given point in time. And I'll just show a graph to put some data on this. This looks at the actual mortgage rates of outstanding loans statewide in Massachusetts. And you can see that 80% of outstanding mortgages have an interest rate below 5%. Prevailing interest rates, if you're going to get a new mortgage today, are in the 6.5% to 7% range. So a big gap there. And what that's meant is a real freezing of the market. So new listings remain extremely low, and listings that do go on the market get snatched up very quickly. So What's this meant in terms of actual affordability for a family that's trying to especially get into first-time home buying? This table's dense and it's in the report if you want to sort of make more sense of it. But this is a simulation of the monthly cost of affording an entry-level home. On the left-hand side is the lowest tier of homes in the market, and then the right-hand side is middle-tier homes. And the combined effect of increased home prices in just 3 years with those increased mortgage interest rates means that the monthly owner costs of owning even a low-end home in Greater Boston has increased by over $1,500 a month. And then the annual income you'd need to not be housing cost burdened to be able to afford that entry-level home up by more than 50%. So a family would need to earn about $160,000 a year to be able to afford even that entry-level home in Greater Boston today. So one final graph from me, which is going to look at the home ownership rate over several decades. And here you can see under the traditional home ownership rate, especially young adults, the yellow dotted line, we've seen a decrease, not surprisingly. The issue here is the traditional home ownership rate only looks at household heads. This gets a little wonky, but it doesn't factor in the dynamic of many young adults maybe moving in with their parents because they can't afford housing or living in larger renter households with other young adults. So there's an adjusted measure we've included in the report card that tries to account for that. And under the adjusted measure, you see how much more home ownership for young adults in particular has declined. Under this adjusted measure, less than a quarter of young adults 25 to 34 have been able to own homes in our region, and that's a sharp decline from several decades ago. Okay, with that, let me invite Aja up to continue core metrics.
Thank you, Luke, for that intro. So we're going to keep rolling with core metrics. The next section we're going to talk about is subsidized housing. And we think it's really important to continue to highlight subsidized housing since it's a critical social safety net for our area so that everyone, including low and moderate income households, can have a safe place to live. So data on subsidized housing isn't typically widely available or frequently updated, but this year we're really excited to have some data that Housing Navigator Massachusetts shared with us on subsidized rentals in the state of Massachusetts, so we can get a little bit more detailed about the stock of subsidized housing that we have in the state. So we'll share that with you. The first graph that we have here is looking at the share of the housing stock in each community type that is made up of subsidized rentals. So this graph doesn't include subsidized ownership units. It only includes subsidized rentals due to our data limitations. But if we were to include ownership units, the picture doesn't really change much. So basically we can see there's like this wide gap between developing suburbs, for example, which only have 3.9% of their housing stock as subsidized rentals, versus metro core communities, especially places like Somerville and Boston and Cambridge, that on average, they have about 14.3% of their housing stock as subsidized rentals. So in those places in the inner core, there's going to be a lot more availability of housing for lower income families. The good thing about using the detailed data that we have now is that we can not just count up the subsidized housing units, but we can do a little bit of work to differentiate between them to describe the characteristics of the different kinds of units that we have. So there's a little bit more of that in the report. But for this presentation, we'll talk about one common difference with housing units, which is age restrictions. Age restrictions are a common feature of subsidized rentals in our area. So here we're looking at the share of the subsidized rental stock that is age restricted to seniors 55 plus, broken down by community type. And here again, we can see wide differences among different communities. So in developing suburbs, maturing suburbs, and streetcar suburbs, half or over half of subsidized rentals are for seniors only. And it is very important to have housing for seniors. They're a vulnerable population and we need to make sure that they have a place to live. Also, in our demographic section of the report, we talk about housing market dynamics and how providing places for seniors to live can sometimes allow them to downsize and free up other housing for households that may have different housing needs. But in our area, unfortunately, these age restrictions can be used as a tool of exclusion. And Katie and Max have done previous work on this, and they've shown that actually at the municipal level, when you look at patterns, wider municipalities tend to have more age restrictions in their subsidized rentals. So again, it's just suggesting that rather than trying to provide housing for seniors, we might be sometimes using these restrictions to limit opportunities for lower income families to find places to live. So now we're just going to keep moving on into the instability section of the report card. We think it's really important to highlight the experience of people who are on the margins of having stable housing. In the report, we have more information on evictions and foreclosures. For this presentation, we're just going to talk about homelessness. So we have a little bit of a good news and a bad news story when it comes to our region on homelessness. This first graph is just showing point-in-time counts of homelessness over time. And if you're following the news, you're probably not surprised to see that in the past couple of years, there has been an uptick in the number of homeless individuals and families that we have in our region. We don't yet have the data for Greater Boston for 2024, but we have reason to believe that that trend has been continuing. So again, good news, bad news story. The bad news, we have a very high homelessness rate, one of the highest homelessness rates in the country. And when we think about structural determinants of homelessness, like high rental prices, it's not that much of a surprise that our homelessness rate is so high. Boston has some of the highest rents in the country. The kind of a little bit of good news is that we do have one of the lowest unsheltered homelessness rates in the country. And that just speaks to some of the robust emergency assistance program that we have in the state. It's also worth mentioning that Massachusetts, compared to other places, has relatively low eviction filings and foreclosures. But again, it's not that we have, completely solved this issue, of course, in the past couple of years. Because of the structural determinants of homelessness that are factoring into making it difficult to find a place to live for low, moderate income households, we've seen this in the past couple of years, a huge uptick in the number of families that are requesting assistance from the state's emergency assistance system. And that system hasn't been able to keep up with the demand. So on the right side of the graph, on this graph, we're showing the number of families who are requesting assistance from the state. And on the right side of the graph, you can see that it has crept up to 7,500 and reached that cap that the state has set. The state says their capacity is 7,500 families in the shelter system. And so since then, there have been some rollbacks in the state's right to shelter protections. And what this graph doesn't show is families who might be requesting assistance from the state and are not able to receive it, or maybe families that might have requested assistance were it to be available. So this is just kind of a snapshot showing the extent of the issue, but of course doesn't tell the whole story. So lastly, in the core metrics section, we have the state policy roundup section again this year, because we think that policy above the hyper-local level is really important for having coordinated action to address our state's housing crisis. Some of these updates were mentioned earlier in the presentation. Lee mentioned the Affordable Homes Act signed earlier this year. I just want to highlight, we also talk about a few updates about the City of Boston in the report, so that's in there. And also some of those things might come up in the panel. But I do want to just highlight Boston Indicator's coverage of the MBTA Communities Law. This is a big year for MBTA communities. We have some more compliance deadlines coming up at the end of this month. Also, last month, the state Supreme Court heard a very important case with the town of Milton that's going to have legal implications for the strength of this law. And so Boston Indicators is continuing to cover everything about MBTA communities in our Upzone updates. And so keep an eye on that if you like updates. Okay, so I'll pass the mic over to Katie, who's going to talk about our special topic.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie Einstein. I'm an associate professor of political science at Boston University, and I'm going to be presenting the special topic on the use of public land. This is co-authored with my BU colleagues Max Palmer and Danielle Mulligan. So I'm going to talk to you today about how we have this amazing resource available to us to build more affordable housing. and that we are squandering it. Right? So we actually have bipartisan agreement among federal, state, and local policymakers that the use of public land could present a really exciting opportunity for getting more housing built. And this is pretty intuitive. We know it is so expensive to build housing in places like Greater Boston. And so especially if we want to produce more affordable housing, what could be better than having free land, right? This is sort of the exciting opportunity. But what I'm going to show you guys today is that our regulatory processes and public opposition have made it incredibly difficult for us to take advantage of this resource. And so instead, we're really underutilizing it. So first, I'm going to show you that public land in Greater Boston is actually widely available and underutilized. I think we have a narrative here that we're totally built out, that there's no way that we have enough public land to build more housing. And we dig into the tax parcel database and show that this is not right. There's actually a lot of vacant land owned by municipal and state governments that we could be using. Then we're going to talk about procurement laws and the housing permitting processes that jointly make it incredibly difficult to redevelop this land into housing. And then we're finally going to conclude by talking about public opposition and the way that it has actually been sometimes weaponized into acquiring public land to stop development. So let's start with the availability of public land. So here we have a chart that's showing you guys the proportion of land across Massachusetts, which is privately owned, owned by the Commonwealth, and owned by municipalities. And you can see here about a quarter of the land, give or take, in the state is actually publicly owned, right? So that's already some evidence that we have a lot of public land. But of course, we use that public land for all sorts of different things that are really valuable. Our schools, our public works, conservation land, right? Those are all really important uses of our public land. But it turns out a lot of this public land is not really being used for those purposes, right? And especially among our municipalities, the data from the tax parcels database from the state suggests that almost half, so 42% of municipally owned land is actually vacant, right? And we compare that to privately owned land, which I think arguably is a lot more built out, right? Almost 90% of privately owned land is non-vacant. And so we take this data to suggest that there is a lot of publicly owned land, especially at the municipal level, that could be better utilized for affordable housing or any number of other goals that we have at the state and local level. So let's just imagine for a minute how we could redevelop that land, right? So we don't need to redevelop all of that vacant land into housing. Again, there's like lots of valid competing things that we might want to do with public land. So let's just imagine we take 5%, a really conservative estimate of that vacant municipal and Commonwealth-owned land. And now let's use the same minimum density as under MBTA communities, which is a decent amount of density, but not sort of overwhelming, right? So let's take that 15 units per acre metric. What that's going to do is produce 72,000 units on municipal land and 13,000 units on Commonwealth land. That's a total of 85,000 units of housing under this sort of very conservative use of publicly owned land. Okay, so why don't we do that, right? We have universal agreement there's a housing crisis. So where is this disconnect between the use of that widely available publicly owned land and what we're actually producing? Let's start by talking about procurement law. I think we dug more into this really opaque area that I ever imagined doing, right? But developing multifamily housing in Massachusetts, we know is super hard in general because of the regulatory process. So even if we take out sort of state law about the redevelopment of public land, just developing anything on privately owned land is really hard. And that's something that I think we really understand well. It's why we have MBTA communities. But it's so much harder to do on public land. So land first has to be declared surplus, which essentially means that it is no longer being used for sort of its original function, but can now be available for other uses. This declaration of surplus requires a 2/3 majority of support from either a town meeting or city council. And anyone who has sat through a town meeting and watched them try to efficiently pass any form of policy knows that that is really hard, and it gets downright toxic when it comes to housing. So if there's any inkling that this land is going to be redeveloped into housing, it becomes exceptionally difficult to get this declaration of surplus through town meeting. And in the report, we document many cases where this process essentially kills projects. Right, okay, so you've made it through this part, right? You somehow got through town meeting. Now you get to go through the RFP process, right? And this is, again, a really understandable policy in place designed to prevent sort of towns from corruptly giving sweetheart deals to favored developers. So it's a policy that has really good origins. But what it does is it creates an incredibly onerous process for developers where they essentially end up going through the design review process twice. First for the RFP, and then as part of the general development process. And again, anyone who has sat through a design review process, right, if you've sat through sort of how those get adjudicated, you can imagine going through that twice creates all sorts of opportunities for unpredictable development and for delay. And so what this means, right, is that a lot of times cities and towns, right, they go into this process saying, we're giving the developer land. Why can't we extract all of these things from the developer for community benefits? But it doesn't actually pencil out, in part because the process is so onerous, right? That we make it so expensive to build on public land that we can't then ask for the kinds of community benefits and deeply affordable housing that I suspect most people in the room would like to see produced on this land, right? And when we talked with affordable housing developers, they all told us we would rather develop on privately owned land than publicly owned land. We would rather deal with, the just normal land use regulations and not have to do this additional sort of public procurement process. In the report, we have many cases talking about sort of how glacial this process is. And just a few highlights. We identify a project in Weston where it has taken over 6 years to build 6 units of affordable housing. They're currently submitting paperwork. So if I do an update for you guys next year, it could say 7+ years to build these 6 units of housing. It's taken 5 years for the city of Somerville to even come up with a plan for about an acre of land next to a T-stop, right? That would be a really nice place to put in some affordable housing. And then, we start to get into a little how federal and state resources might be getting misused as part of this process. Newton was given over $2.5 million in 2021 and 2022 from the federal and state government to redevelop public land into affordable housing. That land is still not being approved. It hasn't even been approved for use as housing, let alone having construction, right? And again, that's sort of money that was earmarked for the production of housing that is not actually producing anything at the moment. So that's the regulatory process. But part of the reason the regulatory process makes development so prohibitive is that members of the public take advantage of it to stop or delay housing. And we have so much evidence about public opposition to housing being a huge challenge for development in Massachusetts, right? And so when we asked folks, like, what's the biggest obstacle to redeveloping public land? They said neighbors who are empowered by leaders and empowered by the regulatory process. Sometimes you don't even get applicants for an RFP because they are anticipating so much opposition. Right? And when we think about the impact of public opposition, it's going to affect any approval through elected bodies and referenda. Anytime you're going through town meeting, it's going to create delays at public hearings. But what I'm going to show you in a minute is perhaps something that hasn't been as sort of systematically understood. It can also lead to the weaponization of public land, facilitated at times by state resources. So what this chart is showing you here, this is a list of 13 instances that we were able to identify in the last 11 years that show us times where cities and towns use public resources, and in half of the cases, they're using CPA funds to buy land explicitly to stop the development of housing. In almost all instances, in 12 of the 13, it was to stop a 40B. So it was to stop the development of affordable housing, right? And again, this is really costly. We identify $50 million in public money that has been explicitly used to block affordable housing. And all but one of those purchases were in response to a 40B. We were able to identify over 1,000 units of housing that were blocked by these land purchases. Again, in many instances, facilitated by a state government program that is supposed to have the preservation of affordable housing as one of its key aims. So what can we do about this, right? So this is a public resource that we are not using to full advantage. So we have a number of recommendations, perhaps first and foremost, that we should be streamlining the process for the disposition of public land. There is no reason that small affordable housing developers need to be going through design review twice to build a small number of units of affordable housing in these communities. So we need to figure out ways to make it easier for these developers who are producing the kind of deeply affordable housing that we want to see on public land. We need to make it easier for them to do this. We also need to reform state funding programs like the CPA so they can't be used to block housing development. This might include taking onerous steps like saying that communities that haven't produced at least 10% of their housing stock as affordable should not be allowed to use CPA funds to build so-called conservation land that is in practice land that they are purchasing to stop housing from being built there. We should also provide technical assistance for municipalities looking to redevelop public land into affordable housing. The RFP process is incredibly difficult, and one of the features of this is that local governments actually cannot consult with developers about what is financially feasible on a given plot of land. And this is, again, because of sort of obvious anti-corruption statutes that you don't want a town to go talk to a specific developer about what they'd like to see for an RFP and then have that developer be able to immediately win that bidding process, right? So there's good reasons we have these policies in place, but they in practice make it very difficult for municipalities to design RFPs that actually pencil out. And then we need to streamline the housing permitting process in general through additional housing reform. And we might think about things like a statewide affordable housing overlay, because even if we solve all of these problems with the public procurement process, we are left with the incredible patchwork of land use regulations that all of our municipalities have put in place that make it incredibly difficult to build. So thank you, and I'm looking forward to hearing what the panelists have to say about addressing these challenges.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Luke, Aja, Katie, for sharing some of the most incredible findings in the report. And thank you all. Good morning. Thank you all for being here. Before I introduce the panelists, I wanted to just thank my TBF colleagues who helped put together both the report and this forum. The indicators team, of course, Luke mentioned by name, from the public policy, Keith Mahoney, events team, Michelle Hinkle, Celia LeBlanc, Jordan Numi, Mimi Huckins, and communications team, Ted McEnroe, Nikki Capiello, and Sandy Kendall. And last, a very special thank you to Mel Nagashima for holding all this together. So thank you all. We'll go till 10:15 with the panel discussion and then open it up for questions, both for our panelists and for our researchers. So please feel free to direct your questions to them as well. And I know Senator Edwards has to leave at about 10:15, I believe, for your next engagement. Okay, all right, great, perfect, wonderful. So quick introductions. There are more detailed bios in the email that came with your registration. And folks actually need no introduction, but Senator Lydia Edwards, chair of the Joint Committee on Housing of the Massachusetts Legislature, former Boston City Councilor, and as senator and city councilor, Senator Edwards has championed affordable housing and was instrumental in passing key legislation such as the Boston Zoning Amendment to include affirmatively furthering fair housing and helping pass the Affordable Homes Act. Greg Minot is the managing principal of Dream Collaborative and leads the development arm of the company, Dream Development. And their portfolio includes rental and ownership housing developments in Roxbury. And you've also been tentatively designated by the BPDA to develop the Boston Water and Sewer Commission's parking lots in Roxbury Nubian Square into affordable and workforce housing. Welcome, Greg. And Kenzie Bach is the administrator of the Boston Housing Authority, one of the largest housing provider in the city of Boston, 10,000 public housing units, almost many thousands of Section 8 vouchers, MRVP, Massachusetts Rental Voucher Program as well. So welcome and thank you. Lee set the table with his remarks about our current context, the change in our administration. I'd like to focus on the state level because as the report identified, we have tremendous opportunity and obstacle available to us at the state level. But I want to start by focusing on housing supply and production, and to have in your remarks, each of you talk about the strategies and initiatives that you are working on that will help increase the supply. And as part of that, if you'd like to add something about maybe one key issue you might be concerned about coming from the federal government, given the change in administration, would love to hear from you. So let me start here with Senator Edwards.
Thank you, and thank you for having this wonderful conversation and continuing to commit to good conversation and I think good trouble, regardless of who is the President of the United States. Housing is a human right, and these conversations further solidify that in this Commonwealth, we do believe in the Commonwealth of all. I will say when it comes to supply and production, the housing bond bill, I would say, would be the biggest step we've taken forward in looking at that. We are looking at a lot of zoning reform. One of the things that we did put in the housing bond bill was to deal with a lot of the public opposition, so that there'd be a $250,000 bond that if you're going to appeal an appeal, that you have to put that money up front and pay for that appeal. The other component that we were looking at is attorney's fees. If you lose that appeal and someone is trying to fight to get their project done, there was a whole list of things, and I want to give credit to Senator Barry Feingold, who really had a package deal focused on removing those obstacles and knowing that so much of the obstacles were coming from well-resourced neighbors, people in the community who just didn't want it by their house. And so I want to give credit to him because he had a whole list, and I think we're going to continue to have that conversation. MBTA laws, we wanted to make sure that cities and towns that actually complied with it were getting favorability in the housing bond bill, right? To assure that if they're going to, you're not going to both say no to housing and then say, please give us money for housing. See how that doesn't work. And so we wanted to make sure we put in some safeguards as well, and looking at cities and towns pushing and moving, but also rewarding them and saying, good job for you, and here's some additional funds. You need to pack in as many carrots as possible. CPA reform is on, I would say, is absolutely top of mind for legislators. It was top of mind when we were negotiating and thinking about the housing bond bill. It is top of mind again. It will likely come in. Another reform I will be introducing is inclusionary zoning reform to bring the threshold down to a simple majority. Right now, if you want to do inclusionary zoning in a lot of towns, you still got to get 2/3, and that's so much fun to get. And so we are looking at, again, inclusionary zoning, but acknowledging that some cities and towns would use that as an abuse and say, well, fine, in order to have your project approved, it's got to be at 70% affordable, just in general. But one of the things we introduced in the Senate and passed in the Senate version of the housing bond bill was capping that simple majority at 13%. And then if you wanted to go higher than that, to get to 2/3. So we're still very much dedicated to making sure that when we do good things in the Commonwealth, they actually can be implemented. So that's to me my supply side contribution. When it comes to the federal government, what I am most concerned about is the incompetence of the new person who's going to run HUD. We had someone who was qualified simply because he lived in public housing. Like, I'm qualified to be a doctor because I was born in a hospital. Like, it was, that's what we had before, and that's what I'm concerned about. Why is this important? Affirmatively furthering for housing, Office of Fair Housing, which we now have and are creating. If you'll remember when the Trump administration was leaving, one of the things he began to attack was that component, was integration, was, no, you won't be forced to have these low-income folks around, all dog whistle for what they really mean in your neighborhoods. He was attacking the very sense that federal dollars should mean civil rights, should mean inclusion, if we're going to give it to them, if we're going to give it to you as a city and town. And that is something, thank goodness, we have implemented on our own. We have our own standards for, and we created an office dedicated to it. But my concern is the federal government conditioning funds for harm. You won't get money unless you make sure that everybody in there has passed a citizenship test 3 times to confirm that they, their children, their best friends, their cousins are not in this country illegally. Like, coming through ways to comb through and cause harm to people conditioned upon getting much needed federal money. Hurting cities and towns and commonwealths that do have their own voucher programs, right? That are more inclusive, maybe more inclusive in terms of income, and making sure that they cause harm. That is my biggest concern, is the harm that they intend to cause, that they have campaigned on causing. And so again, these conversations are necessary not only to make sure that we undo our inefficiencies in our housing policy, but also to make sure that we come back, convene, and remind ourselves of our dedication to housing as a human right and how we fortify against that harm.
Wonderful. Thank you, Senator Edwards. Greg?
Thank you, Senator Edwards. Can you guys hear me?
Yep.
Okay, great. And again, thanks to the Boston Foundation, Sonny Lee Pelton, and the researchers for this incredible work. I read the research paper cover to cover, and it reflected a lot of what we experience day to day trying to develop housing in the Commonwealth. Listening to it again this morning, I was like, wow, maybe I should consider a career change. No, I'm just kidding.
We need you to stay doing this work, Greg.
But we are committed. I think it does tell us that we need to double down. I think we do need to be more collaborative in our work with policymakers. I mean, as developers, what we are interested in is places that make it easy for us to do our work, because as you can hear, it's an incredibly difficult job. And we want to go where people want housing. And not everyone wants the housing, and that's kind of the reality. And with those two combination of things, willing developers, which there are plenty of in the Commonwealth, great developers, and places that want the housing is where we're going to see the supply. So from our perspective as a developer, what I tell our team is we go to places where we get slack, right? It's an acronym. So, and I'll break that down for a second. So we want to go to places where we can get scale and speed. So I double up on the S. But scale in terms of where can we get enough land to aggregate to make enough difference to make a dent in the housing. It takes just as much effort to permit 12 units as it does 200 units, right? So that's where we want to go. Speed is an important factor because, again, it's an incredibly complicated RFP process or zoning permitting process, and so the speed matters. Where you're taking 6+ years, that's 6+ years of lots of pre-development capital that's out there, and it's expensive. We want to go to places where we can find the land, and the City of Boston has done a great job of providing through their citywide land audit. You touched on it, where we have access to the Boston Water and Sewer Commission parcel, which was part of that citywide land audit, where we see 4.5 acres of land that was taken by urban renewal now having the opportunity to be restored for 402 units of housing, affordable home ownership, seniors, rental for families, and all that. We'd like to see more municipalities do that and be advocates for that kind of use of their public land. They also make it such that one thing that was very innovative that we would like to see continuing that housing supply conversation, and it touched on in the report, is how do we make this RFP process and you now trying to produce the housing more seamless. So in the case that we're going through right now, we're able to submit the RFP that doubled as our finance application, and it took us almost through, we had to make some tweaks, but it took us almost through our zoning process, because that initial pre-development capital, you could spend anywhere from $80,000 to $300,000 easy of your own money without ever seeing any subsidy or any kind of capital from a bank come in. So that's really important. So that land piece is key. So access, again, we like to go to places, so the SLA, I'm working through the acronym here. So access where there's already ready infrastructure, water, sewer. As you go outside of the city, that becomes harder to do, but we need to rely more on partnership from municipalities to bring those essential services to the site. And then we go to places, so in terms of cost, which is the SLAC, so now we're at cost. Interest rates are a big deal. That's what we're looking to in terms of what is going to happen at the federal level to help us get through and continue with our production. One of the things you touched on in terms of what concerns us about the changes, the Build America Bureau, which was something on the DOT that was established, addresses the interest rate problem for large-scale projects that need a lot of infrastructure. And they have a program called the RIF program, which prioritizes sites near rail infrastructure. And so that's a great program. It touches on TOD sites. That's something we'd like to see continued and help us to reduce the cost of the housing that we're producing from an interest rate standpoint. Then the last part, so SLAC, now we're at K. We go to places where people are kind. Kind to us, and what I mean by that is that they are looking to, they welcome the housing. They want to help their partners in either helping us to bring subsidy for infrastructure, or they're willing to work with us through a friendly zoning process, whether it's a friendly 40B or something similar. I think one of the great distinguishers about developing in Boston is that you can sense there's a partnership with Boston. They're on your side, they want you to develop the housing, and that makes a world of difference in a very complicated and long process. So.
Thank you for that. That's a great acronym. Appreciate that. And it's really helpful to hear your perspective. Our job to create the funnel that allows you to move through in order to get to the place where you can develop, because as a developer, you're not looking to be the one to fight for that housing. You want to go where it makes business sense, where the conditions are already, as you said, welcoming. So appreciate that perspective. Right. Kenzie, turn to you.
Thanks so much, and thank you as well for having me. And it's great to be on this panel with so many great colleagues and co-conspirators on the housing front. I do just really want to say that the City of Boston is looking to be a partner in housing production. It's a huge priority of Mayor Wu's, and it's something that we've really been able to put front and center in BHA's plans. So I was just thinking about the numbers that Katie gave, the sort of 85,000, and for us at BHA, the mayor announced in January our Faircloth initiative, which is our goal to build all 3,000 additional Faircloth units that the Boston Housing Authority is entitled to have over the next decade. And then I was sitting here thinking about, additionally, we have a large number of redevelopment projects around the city where we are replacing very old public housing units in kind, in the sense with the same number of deeply affordable units for the same residents, but then also adding density. And just across those different sites that are already permitted, that's a net of 5,000 units. I was just sort of adding it up in the corner. So, you take the 3,000, you take the 5,000, and that means that for BHA, like, we have active plans for 8,000 units, which I hope is a decent contribution towards the 85,000 statewide. And obviously, we are just one piece of the city of Boston. But I think we're really excited about that work. It's amazing. I'll get to the federal side in a second, but it is amazing to have, I think, the strongest city and state support for housing, and for the Housing Authority work specifically that we've had in many generations. I mean, between the Affordable Homes Act that Senator Edwards helped get passed, and on the city side, just significant dollars in all these redevelopment projects are coming from the city directly. And Mayor Wu's been a big leader on this. It's just, we do feel very supported at both those levels. We're really excited about this Faircloth initiative, and I want to give the Boston Foundation a shout out because one of the things that we've been looking at is the fact that, so the BHA's been around for about 8 decades, and for 5 of those decades, building net new, deeply affordable housing was a core function of our mission. So it's like we built 1,000 units in the 30s, we built 4,000 units in the 40s, 5,000 in the 50s, like 2,000 in the 60s, actually another like 2,000 in the 70s, and then we opened our last new public housing development at Senior Building in 1983, and then for 30 years didn't build any net new stuff. We did projects that were redeveloping our housing, and so we got higher quality units in some cases for our residents, but a lot of those projects, sort of up until the Obama administration, were resulting in a net loss of units. That's the reason that we've got the 3,000 Faircloth units that we could still build back, because we de-densified when we went from brick walk-ups to townhouses. And so for us, recognizing that actually it is in our organizational DNA to create new units, and especially at that kind of deeply affordable level, and to recognize that, it's one thing for folks to think that public housing sort of has had its day and should pass away, and it's another to recognize that around the city of Boston, in a large number of our neighborhoods and zip codes, the only way that low-income people, that seniors who have lived there their whole life, that families who want to raise kids can live there is because of this housing that our predecessors created in the 1940s, 1950s, right? And so we're really devoted to the idea that, hey, we would love for this to be a decade where we at least put those additional 3,000 Faircloth units on the map. We also do this additional development of that other 5,000, and we sort of are creating a legacy that both addresses this very real crisis that we're in and means that decades from now, people will say, oh, well, they had a pretty productive decade in the mid-2020s and on. So that's our big objective, and we talked to the Boston Foundation this year about the fact that to ramp up for that, we need staffing, and we need some staffing that in the long run, the development sort of pays for itself. But at the beginning, as all the CDCs and developers in the room know, there's some kind of loss leader aspect to this. And so the Boston Foundation has very generously supported us in getting some of those staff members on board so that we can really rev up this Faircloth initiative. So it's a huge example of this organization putting its money where its mouth is in terms of supporting this big city initiative. So thank you for that.
Thank you for that, Kenzie. Just picking up on that, I want to pick up on the social housing pilot in the Affordable Homes Act, and Senator Edwards would love to hear some more about that. The terminology, social housing, public housing, would love to hear a little bit more about what the intent was in that social housing pilot, and also to draw out the fact that public housing is the only form of publicly owned housing. Well, some of it is now, jointly owned with the joint ventures, and what that means. Maybe a little bit about your waiting list, even while you're building all of these new units, and the incredibly supportive role that public housing continues to play in our housing landscape. And then, Greg, would love to hear from you about the fact, about the market the numbers related to housing production. There used to be a time when market rate housing would actually subsidize affordable housing. Now we're looking to subsidize even unsubsidized, what could be market rate housing. So where the financing is going, and if we were to consider public resources as targeting the households with the least number of options, where does that leave us if we can't even make housing pencil out? So that's a lot, but would love for you to pick it up in sort of any part that you feel appropriate.
I'll just touch very briefly, then I'll turn it over for the social housing, if that's okay, to Kenzie. I think so much of what the point of the housing bond bill and including that pilot program, and there's a lot of other pilot programs in there. There's foreclosure mediation pilot program. There's the pilot program to reduce the entry cost for renters to get in, such that you can buy an insurance policy and pay the premium on the insurance policy rather than paying a security deposit. There's a lot of different experimental, interesting things in access to the housing bond bill. Specifically on this one, a lot of what I think we're trying to do and need to continue to push for is the narrative around public housing. It's not for them over there, any more than you think like the T is for them over there. It is infrastructure. And you need to see it as part of what commonwealths, what state governments do and provide. We provide sidewalks, we provide housing, it needs to be part of that. So when you think of social housing, when you think of public housing and the public good it is providing, we need to start to have it as a narrative and part of like you're not functioning as a state if you don't have a sewer system. You're not functioning as a state if you don't have a housing system. That's the point of a lot of this conversation and packaging the way we are. When it comes to social housing, and when it comes to redevelopment, so Kenzie and I are kindred spirits. We also served in the city council together, and we're back and forth in a lot of our great ideas for housing. And at the time, I represented Charlestown, which has the single largest housing and oldest housing development in Bunker Hill. And part of the social housing is to fix or acknowledge that what we are having to do, which is the public-private partnership to redevelop our housing, our public housing infrastructure and stock. It's a 1-for-1, which is great. It's an incredible thing that they did. It's a 1-for-1. Then adding 2 additional units that are market rate to help pay for the 1-for-1, but also to make sure that we have a density, all right? The problem for a lot of people is there's no middle. It's deeply affordable and market. And that's not where a lot of people fall in. And because of the long list to get into the deeply affordable, we're not even really providing more units, though we are getting 8,000 more. Mm-hmm. But the issue with social housing is there can be a graduation in support that may decrease, but that goes up a little more to provide for working middle class individuals, with the hope that the market rate and their contributions coming out of there, that's maybe not as much, can come and help support the subsidized units. The point is a third, right? You get 30% of deeply affordable, 30% of middle income-ish, and then market rate. But that the government is seeing developing that way and subsidizing so that it can be developed that way. And the social housing is something I want to give credit to Mike Connolly. I know he pushed for this a great deal, a representative from Cambridge, friend, and pushing to make sure that we start to see how this can go. The reason why it's a pilot program is we need to see how this can go, how much it's going to cost, dealing with the same public opposition, dealing with the same regulatory issues. And so partly it's to make sure that we are coming up with a new system that doesn't exclude the missing middle. And right now, the system we have, due to the way numbers work, does, when we're redeveloping and densifying at the same time. But I wanted to kick it over, because I know BHA will be one of the people who have to do this pilot program. I'd love to hear. I just get to write it. You have to implement it.
I'll just quote directly from the report. Greater Boston simply isn't producing the smaller, reasonably priced housing that might help these larger homes turnover, in the context of turnover of larger homes, but the missing middle that you talked about. Yeah. Sorry, go ahead. And I think we have about 5 more minutes before we open it up for questions.
I'll be very quick. So I think the basic concept of social housing as a term, as the senator alluded to, is really the idea of like trying to make housing support accessible to a wider set of incomes. And obviously that's very challenging when we have 42,000 families on the public housing wait list, right? So that's it's just like the need at that extremely low income level is huge. But we also know that, there are other countries that have been very successful in sort of like having those systems be more inclusive, really including the middle class. And it does in the long term also, having that type of middle class buy-in to your social housing system, it helps sustain budgets, it helps with income mixing in communities, it can make it so that you're not paying as much subsidy for every unit. So there's I think there's a lot of interest on our side in the US in sort of thinking about what could that look like here. One of the concrete sort of sets of tools that are in the bond bill, so there's the social housing pilot from Mike Connolly. There's also the Momentum Fund, which the Momentum Fund is designed to get market rate housing moving again, but it's inherently market rate housing that has at least 20% deed restricted affordable units. That's Mass Housing's charter. And so one of, I think, the interests, that's sort of okay, how do we move mixed income development that again might have the senator's challenge of the of that very deeply affordable and wealthier kind of split. But I think one of our real interests, and it's one of the things that we're looking at with the Housing Accelerator Fund, the $100 million fund that the mayor announced in September, which is really meant to be kind of a complement to Momentum Fund on Boston's side, is, hey, if we could help folks get their projects to happen by buying out the prohibitively expensive capital markets for at least a slice of their stack, right, and kind of have cheaper public equity replacing that private equity, is there, in the first instance, that might just be enough to get a project moving that isn't moving right now. But we're also interested in the question of, in the projects that, for instance, these mixed income buildings that are permitted on my land, is there a way that we can provide enough relief with cheaper public capital that we can also get some more of those middle income units to happen? Mm-hmm. And that's something that Montgomery County, Maryland has done successfully with their housing production fund, which is kind of also in this model. And it's basically the idea that, the public, we can't spend our way out of this problem. There is not enough public money to subsidize housing production to the scale that we need. There is not. And it's just something that we all have to accept, because sometimes it's we're all very focused on the public spend programs, and they're super important, and LIHTC's super important, and all the federal stuff, and you can't get there from here, right, in terms of the numbers. So the insight of these types of housing production fund mechanisms and the Mayor's Housing Accelerator Fund is, okay, but public money can go a lot further in some instances if we look at public finance solutions than if we're just doing public subsidy solutions. If I can put money into your project, get it going, and then get that money back with a return that is not what I would have gotten as a capital markets investor, but is more than zero, then I can put it back in and invest in the next project. And it's a way to do a smaller appropriation that affects many projects. So I'm pretty excited about that. I think we're really excited for it to actually help us move the next building at Charlestown in the senator's former district, and I think it's really promising. I think just the one thing that I want to say that is the biggest scary thing on the federal side, and I'm seizing my opportunity to say it in this room because I know there are a lot of developers, CDCs, others, is so much of the production that we BHA are planning and that we support, including for others, involves the project-based vouchers. And I would just say that the voucher appropriation is under significant threat in the new Congress. But I think that there is some hope, because I think that there are significant landlords, significant private interests that also rely on the voucher appropriation. There's a much less wide coalition, unfortunately, for the public housing appropriation. And I just think that even in the Congress that we anticipate having, I think that every congressperson has in their district people who they are likely to know who are supported by this federally supported housing. And I really think, I'm not sure folks in general realize that the nationwide, we're really tapped out on the current voucher appropriation. So half the housing authorities in the country are in shortfall. In August, HUD swept the reserves of the people who were underspending their voucher allocations in order to make whole the people who were overspending their voucher allocations. Those folks who are overspending, which includes us at Boston, it's because rental inflation has gone up so much faster than general inflation. And so I just want to really stress that, because somebody in this room could be connected to an organization that could talk to one of the 5 Republican congressmen who are going to need to be sympathetic on this front. So I just really want to stress that I think when we think about how we have space for deeply affordable folks in housing production in the Commonwealth right now, it's those federal subsidies that help those units pay like market, mm-hmm. which helps make the whole thing pencil and really keep a space for them. So I do think that in the midst of everybody thinking about what's coming in January and where we're going, really advocating for the voucher appropriation needs to be at the top of the list.
Thank you for that. It's such an important factor, even in housing production, when those are project-based. Greg, do you want to talk about the financing piece? And thank you for talking about financing as an alternative to direct subsidy, because it's certainly something that foundations also have part of their as part of their toolbox.
Yeah.
Final word,
definitely.
Greg?
So yeah, the financing piece is critical. The build program that offers these low interest rates are gonna help. What I would say though is we touched on it during the report about investing technical assistance as part of the solution, and I just want to go back to the housing authority piece, that there is such a need out, even in Boston, of course, but outside of Boston. I mean, because your team has done a great job in terms of mobilizing housing authority land, whether it's in Charlestown or South Boston, to produce housing. But outside of Boston, there's smaller housing authorities. I think of my town in Andover that has a wait list of 50,000 for a town of 30,000, and has a wait list from 2009. And they have great land connected to resources in the downtown, and that would be prime for middle income housing, but it does, they would need technical assistance to figure it out. If I try and help them as a developer, that would disqualify me from, pursuing those projects. So I think that's an incredible opportunity that I encourage the Boston Foundation or others to think about grants and other support for them, because the land basis is a key piece to all of this, and getting that land at below market rates to be able to afford to deliver middle income housing. Part of the reason it doesn't exist today is because there's no incentives to build it. Either there's lots of incentives for low income, and for the free market, that's why you have mega mansions, right? Because then you can afford to pay whatever for a $2+ million home. But the middle, there isn't much incentive. So I would just encourage more incentives to be provided for that. For that piece, there's also, the last thing I'll say in terms of the incentives is I'm for walkable neighborhoods, for open space, sidewalks and all of that, but some of the incentives that are needed to do middle income, it's not as intensive as let's say like low income housing tax credits and other subsidies, but it is needed for a gap filler of some kind, because it is still very expensive. If you're building a house for $600,000 and yet the market can only afford $700,000, there's not enough profit. If something goes wrong, you lose your shirt. And so the way the incentives are structured right now is that it depends on if you're a half mile from a train, or there's a bus stop near your house, or there's a walkable score. The rate's high in order to compete for that funding, which is all good and laudable goals, but it leaves out a broad section of developable land and the middle income demographics that live in those areas. So that's what I would encourage, to look at some of those parameters that may exclude some of those necessary gap fillers to help produce that middle income housing.
Thank you, and perhaps an expansion of our transit system to make sure that all developable land has access to the T.
That as well.
Excellent. Well, thank you all. We have about 10 minutes, so I wanted to open it up for questions. Our researchers are here as well, so if anyone would like to address your question through the data in the report, please feel free to do so. And I know this is not a shy crowd. Oh, wow, it is a shy crowd. Oh. Yes, go ahead.
Thank you. Thank you very much for the report. My name is Charlie Homer. I was very active in GBIO's Housing Justice Campaign. I guess a question for Senator Edwards. One of the disappointments in the wonderful Affordable Homes Act was the lack of inclusion of the real estate transfer tax or fee. Could you talk about the opportunity again for generating funds for building more deeply affordable housing and again middle income housing through something like taxes on the high-end luxury housing that we heard about today? Thank you.
Sure. It was one of the disappointments to a lot of people that we did not get the transfer fee done. I do think that the conversation, however, is not over. There are a lot of people who, and cities and towns, who will be reintroducing their home rules. There's also different ways in which we can look at generating funds. One is the CPA reform, just outright CPA reform. If you're collecting funds and you're not spending them, for example, if you're just using them for land preservation, there's a way in which we can demand more from those cities and towns, or to possibly ask them to forfeit the funding. There's also, we're going deeper into the deed excise tax. I think that's actually something even, it was bipartisan support. Charlie Baker had come up with increasing the deed excise tax as a component. There is a version of it that kind of splits it under the HERO Act between housing and environmental. And I'm of the housing for housing mindset. But so if we were to increase the deed excise tax, that's another way in which you can generate a lot of funds. It can be spent at the county level. That did not also make it. So there's different ways in which we have to look at ways to generate, through normal transactions that we are having, additional funds, plus, of course, the housing bond bill. So we'll be looking at it.
Thank you for that. Go ahead.
Thank you. Hi, my name is Jenna. I am working with the City of Boston as the AFFH zoning assistant, and it's great to hear all of this and kind of putting it into the context of what's going on, what our work is doing related to housing. I wanted to pick up more on the part of public perception and transparency, and how those two might be going hand in hand, especially as we think about how a report card like this might be digested by public audiences, constituents, but then also developers, and then thinking about in our roles how maybe we're trying to make our work in affordable housing kind of more palatable or digestible to the public, and the language that we use around it and the narrative, Senator Edwards, especially, that you noted in that too. But just wanted to hear more from your perspectives, communicating with constituents and communicating with developers. Are there certain types of language that we should be using? Are there certain formats, things that we can be doing to kind of progress the conversation on affordable housing away from this kind of othering and coded othering that is happening into more of the language of infrastructure? Are there certain languages, terms, forms of communication that we should be pushing for that go beyond just saying infrastructure and just swapping out a word?
Well, I think you probably each have something to add there, but Greg, I wonder if you have had, and if you have any insights just based on sort of your experience with community meetings, things that you hear back, and some strategies that you might have used to connect.
Yeah, so what we've, great question. One thing that we have found is it's easy when people can hide, that you hear some of the othering comments or things, really backwards comments like, bringing affordable housing to the neighborhood is going to bring crime and drugs, and you hear these things all the time, even in areas that even in the city of Boston you still hear those things today, which is alarming. But one thing that we have seen that's helpful in these community meetings is to have the conversation kind of more in a workshop style, where the folks around the table, it's harder to say those things when you're in a group of people, a large group of other people. You find a lot of those things coming out either over social media or one-on-one interactions with elected officials that might be empowered by their community member to resist a project, but to have those conversations exclusively in an open workshop forum, it becomes what we found is a more humane conversation and less those incendiary comments. So.
I think a couple of things. One is that I think it's really important for those of us who are housers to be vocal and consistent about pushing housing everywhere. I think a very common rhetorical strategy is, of course I believe in housing, but just this isn't exactly the right place. And there's this sense that we could cite it in a better place. And I think just the point that we are so far from having the housing that we need in Massachusetts that in fact we need all the places. If I am proposing housing in this location and your response to me is, I really think there should be housing over there instead, my response is, great, there too. right? Like, because I just think people don't necessarily understand the scale of the challenge that we're facing. But I do think that there's this suspicion that kind of goes in multiple directions. Like, I think that folks in our communities, you know, our lower income communities of color in Boston get very frustrated with the accurate sense that the suburbs have been very successful in blocking housing, and they're disproportionately white and wealthy. And so there's a sense of like, hang on, why isn't housing happening over there? And then I think that a lot of times in our suburban communities, we hear, frankly, around pretty small housing interventions, like, I can't believe you're going to change the whole nature of this town. So I think like it's actually one of the great things to me about MBTA communities is the idea of saying, like, we're all going to be part of the solution here. And it was also a big piece of the Affirmatively Furthering Fair Housing legislation that Senator Edwards and I worked on the council, and it's great that you're in that role for the city, to kind of try to change the narrative around, you know, providing affordable housing and housing for protective classes as like something that we were making somebody do, and instead sort of be like, hey, like, we live in a city that has been shaped by like racially segregated housing history, and so one of the things that we like all need to do together is to affirmatively further fair housing to counter that. And so all we're asking your project to do is be part of the solution. It's not that we're saying that you did the harm. It's that the same way that like we all need to have every project think about what it's doing from a decarbonization perspective, because we are all living in this environment. We also need everybody to be part of that solution. And I do think that that helps to mitigate one of the things that people do, which is to suggest it should just be somewhere else.
Appreciate it. Thank you. And a lot of work for us, clearly, to spread the word. So we take that on as well. And I'll just point out that a lot of the work, research that the BU team and Katie's team has done is talk about the nature of public meetings, some of the change, what happens when you do them as focus groups, the kind of representation you get there, and also the Office of Fair Housing sort of as a recommendation. Oh, we have Tim. Hello.
Hello, Tim Reardon. I'm the Chief of Data and Research at Executive Office of Housing and Livable Communities. Great report, as usual, from TBF and the team and the BU folks. One thing I wanted to mention is, you know, I love the focus on the use of publicly owned land. And the senator didn't mention the legislature also included a lot of streamlining for the disposition of state-owned land, and that's an active process right now with HLC working with DCAM and a lot of other state agencies to dig deep and narrow down from 12,000 parcels down to 115 sites. I'm working with my colleague Matt Martin, who's up there on that. So we are on that case on the state end, and so it's great for this report to shine a light on the opportunities for how that can be done at the municipal level to pair with that. I guess one of my questions is maybe for Greg and Kenzie, sort of on two different sides. You know, one of the big challenges here in maintaining and expanding our housing supply is the cost of construction, the challenges with financial feasibility, the barriers that public housing authorities face in building, rebuilding, maintaining. What do you think are some of the key things that HLC should be looking at to improve the financial feasibility of market-driven, you know, or privately financed development, and to facilitate better use of our public housing resources?
So I do think about this a lot. It is very expensive to do construction. I think, you know, one of the things that we've been working on, so for instance, at our Charlestown site, we've got the first building. We're about to do a ribbon cutting, and we'll have families moving in December. And there we really worked with Leggett McCall, who are our partners there, and Corcoran to like really think about how the design of the building could be something that was like much easier to assemble on site, and could also, like, we would be in a position where through a lot of sort of upfront work on the design of that first building, that it's much easier to get to finished drawings and also a compressed timeline for constructing the second building. Like, this is an opportunity that we have more when we're doing like a big scale project like the one at Charlestown or like our one at South Boston. But of course, like, scale projects are also how you're going to get to like big numbers of units. So I do think that one thing is like, you know, thinking about how does HLC and others like incentivize that sort of like the kit of parts, the sort of like, you know, hey, could we have really high quality design solutions, but that don't have to be reinvented for every building? I was thinking about it when I was recently in another state, and I can immediately pick out their public housing buildings because they look the same as all of ours. And I was thinking, gee, like that's been a huge challenge for the stigma around public housing, is that sort of like universal experience. But it's also how they put up so much of it so quickly, right? So like I think we need to find some happy medium where like we're not going back to the like it's all identical buildings and it doesn't look the same as other buildings, but we are saying how do we have really excellent design solutions, and then how do we replicate them, because there is like this big piece of the timeline and the cost that has to do with like reinventing the wheel on each project. And it's not that I don't love all of our bespoke projects, and everyone else's in the rooms too, but I think there's got to be some opportunity there.
Yeah, I would just add to that. Exactly right, Kenzie. It comes down to the design. I mean, we can't necessarily control we have to control what we can control, and what we can't necessarily control is what the general contractor or the trades are telling us. So what we try and do is control the size of the project, the efficiency of the units, the unit sizes. We piloted a multi-generational home around, well, it's taken us, believe it or not, 8 years to do 12 units because of neighborhood opposition and different things, which added to the cost of the units ultimately. And we were hoping to make that market, but we ended up having to make it a Commonwealth builder. So it's 80 and 100% AMI, but not quite the market we were hoping to achieve. So it's a work in progress. But there, what we did successfully was we were able to come up with a standard sort of kit of parts, to your point about having very efficient units. In this case, it was how do we create homes for seniors that could live also alongside their families, and create a very efficient one bedroom on the ground floor and a 3-bedroom above. So we're trying to be creative in terms of meeting the needs of the neighborhoods, but also in an efficient envelope, looking at the sustainability practices as well to keep those utility costs low for those eventual homeowners or renters. So those are the kind of things that we're trying to do, and also reaching out to our modular partners to help us to standardize a lot of the work that we're doing to make it more predictable in terms of the cost and the speed of getting these homes to market.
Okay, so we are at time. Thank you. I want to thank our panelists. So please join me in appreciation. Thank you. And thank you all for being here today. There's a lot of work for us to do together, and I know we're going to be successful because we're doing it together. So appreciate it very much. Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thank you so much.